Legislative power is a fairly recent development, as we'll examine in the following slides. In order to examine legislative power, we must also look at executive and judicial. I'm drawing a very broad distinction here between Latifundium society and feudal society, which we'll get into, and I'm calling particular attention to some developments of the Plantagenet era, which would be the Assize of Clarendon, Magna Carta, and what I'm calling the first gentry parliament. So here we're examining the farm as the metaphor. So for both of our societies, we're looking at um, and pre-9th century government. Let's just say there was not a lot of it. A lot's been written about Sparta and Athens and their various governments. Uh, but let's just suffice it to say that there's this mixing of executive, legislative, and judicial authority, usually with some dominant executive who will circulate around whatever the territory they are circulating around. And then you have to keep in mind that often these governments would have dual, uh, they have peers that were dual use, as it were, had dual hats, where they were a magistrate or a judge and a senator. Keep in mind, I think Emperor Palpatine or Senator Palpatine in the Star Wars movie sort of encapsulates this as the villainous idea that this sort of mixing of power can bring about. Here's a slightly more formal definition of what I'm calling a large farm government or a latifundium society. The Roman Senate is sort of a source for peers because you were either brought into the club or kicked out by the censor. And so you're all fighting for that top position to control the government, first being the consuls, later being the dictators. There's no real distinction between legislation and policy. And then the Senate itself is the one that goes out and serves as proconsuls in the provinces. And so, in some sense, this you got if you've read anything about city states, you got to talk about the urban center, the Atsi or the Cora, or which is the countryside. And so, politically speaking, you had Rome. All roads lead to Rome, and then you had everybody else. That was the countryside. So you have just this one urban center politically, and then you had this massive amount of countryside. So please keep that in mind. So I'm sure some of y'all are aware of what's called the cursus honorum or the tres militiae. This is sort of the tip of the iceberg, as it were, of the Roman uh, executive system. Because I think it's important to point out here that you've got to understand even a pleb in Rome, as part of the plebiscite in Rome, is somewhere on the cursus honorum. Maybe they have no chance of ever making it into the Senate even, but they are part of the politics of Rome, and therefore they are part of uh, the political society. So if you weren't in Rome, you didn't get a chance to vote, and you couldn't move up the cursus honorum. So there was no absolutely zero representation uh, with the provinces. And so anybody who even has a slight inkling of history can understand what this sort of political system leads to. So the provinces were, in a sense, still left alone. We've already talked about the Etsi and the Cora, and then this whole idea that shows itself quite prominently in American politics, this whole taxation without representation. So on one side of the fence, you had the province that is being taxed and doesn't have any representation in the big house in Rome. And then on the other side, we're speaking specifically of Germany here, because Tacitus has mentioned it and studied it even in his time. So you have sort of the feudal system, as it were, developing in Germany. And then these feudal forces, or what would eventually turn into what we describe as feudal forces, The smaller farms banded together actually tend up being more powerful than just one giant farm that was Rome. So the Manor Farm is just a smaller example of the Latifundium. Still a farm. You still have a mixing of executive, legislative, and judicial authority. However, I want to point out the difference that this is a political distinction as opposed to what Caesar would deal with in the conquest of Gaul or any time earlier in history where they're dealing with just princes and tribes on the border. This is something different with the Germans, where they have this idea, this growing idea of the feudal manor farm, or what would become the feudal manor farm. Also, around this time, you have the church having achieved international or transnational status. And of course, this would cause issues later on down the road. But just keep in mind the differences between the early tribes and the Roman Empire versus the German proto-feudal system as described in Tacitus and the later empire and where we see the sort of the collapse of the Roman Empire. The large executive, has admitted they've had too much work and they need to divide up that work. And so they hand it out to their peers. And this is the idea of peerage, and the English peerage system and the European peerage system would develop out of this idea, where you hand a small executive a piece of that power, a little bit of that territory, and say, you go take care of all that. And so we see that happening in feudal society. Also, around this time, we've pointed out that the church is sort of helping. At this point, it is kind of helping. It's giving out, sort of taking that same feudal responsibility and taking care of its own clergy. But again, this would cause problems, and that's exactly what we'll be looking at moving forward. So we can liken this transition from the latifundium to feudal as sort of a suburban political move. So we're moving to sort of these new suburban, almost city or actual city centers that are apart from Rome. So it's suburban from Rome. And so you still have the same idea of mixing, and then usually a fief would have three positions, which we'd identify now, later on with being separate powers. The army officer being within the executive, the CEO of the holdings being within legislative. That explanation for that will probably be in another video. And then the judge, which obviously would be judicial. And then I kind of like to think of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in uh, pre-unification Britain are probably a good example of like the maximum extent of the individual part of this system before it finally gets birthed into the nation state. But again, that's probably for another video. So, as part of the background of this Assize of Clarendon, we need to point out that I think a lot of uh, the English population at the time felt that, quote, clergy, because we're using the clergy term very loosely, because anybody who was even remotely connected to the church in any sort of way, the lowest friar of any sort, would still be tried within the church's judicial system. And oftentimes, at least according to the writings and everything of the time, this would essentially letting a murderer get off. There was this idea of criminals getting away with way too much. And so Henry II stepped in with the Assize of Clarendon. And this is where he created the judicial inquest with the circulating jurists, and the idea that the local community needs to have a say about whatever criminality is going on within that community. And so this is what we look all the way back to into our American jury system, the grand jury, the petit jury. And the idea that here Henry II was checking the power of the church. And this is also where we look back to our ideas of dictum, stare decisis, and ratio decidendi, which are basically the by the way parts of an opinion of a judge, the Similar cases should be judged similarly. That's the stare decisis. And then, of course, the legal principle in question at whatever time the judge is ruling on, it's a ratio decidendi. So, what is the power of the jury system? I think it's true even today that you have many people, many people, more people than you would probably imagine. They would rather trust the village idiot than any authoritative figure of the government. This is very true even now, and it was true back then, I'm sure. So why? What's the power of the jury? Well, that's the power of the jury right there. The Magna Carta is a much celebrated uh, document in American political history, but it's also very perplexing. So I'm going to read the introductory paragraph uh, from Dan Jones's Magna Carta. 800 years after it was first granted beneath the trees of Runnymede by the fertile green banks of the River Thames, the Magna Carta is more famous than ever. This is strange. In its surviving forms, there are four known original charters dating from June 1215. The Magna Carta is something of a muddle, a collection of promises extracted in bad faith from a reluctant king, most of which concern matters of arcane 13th century legal principle. A few of these promises concern themselves with high ideals, but they are few and far between. Vague and idealistic statements slipped between longer and more perplexing sentences describing the customary fee that a baron ought to pay a king on the occasion of coming into an inheritance, or the protocols for dealing with debt to the crown, or the regulation of fish traps along the River Thames and Medway. Just keep in mind that despite all the arcaneness, this is something of the origin of the House of Lords in Britain. Simon de Montfort was a controversial figure in his own time, very controversial as it turns out. And I'm not going to focus too much attention on him. Fascinating character study and also important to the development of Britain. But the important part to bring out is the so called Simon de Montfort's Parliament, which we're tracing as the earliest origin of what we might call the House of Commons in uh, England. And so, again, this idea of expanding territorial representation, it's not just the people who are kings and barons who deserve to have representation or peers, senators in uh, Rome. It should be representation is something for everybody. We're starting to see those ideas here. So, in quick summation, we have 100 years where we see the development from feudal farm-based government to we see the earliest separation of powers, the idea of opposing political parties, and perpetual statute law, and of course the weak idea of a territorial nation state. And like all my other videos, here are a list of my sources for this video in no particular order. If you want a full citation, just let me know and I'll give it to you in the comments.